Welcome to Michel's Political Parties, our discussion video. I'm joined by Academic Agent and Owen, as usual. Gio couldn't make it today, unfortunately. He's got break the rules commitments. But nevertheless, we're going to get into the text. You might have watched my first video on this. It was originally intended to be a two-part series, but there was an accidental issue with how it was recorded, which created this muffled audio. So I decided to take that video down because of the shitty audio. That video you can still watch on Odyssey though. So if you go to my Odyssey channel, there'll be a link in the description. If you really want to watch that video or whatever, download the video, you can go there. But I wanted to just redo essentially the whole text in one big conversation. The first half of the text, he's just kind of laying out more fundamental principles that he starts tying together in the second part of the text anyway. So I think that this video will stand alone quite well. Plus, we have Academic Agent here, so I think he'll be able to tie everything together quite nicely. So I'm going to just kind of give my general overview of the fundamental ideas in the text without getting to the specifics. I'll throw it to the other two so they can give their elongated takes, and then we'll do a discussion at the end. Also, just a little bit of housekeeping. My Twitter was banned a couple days ago, inexplicably. So if you want to find me, I am on Telegram. You can find my Telegram in the description. I'm also on Discord. You can find the invite link to the Discord server in the description. Those are the places where you can find me in the meantime until I figure out a way to make some alt Twitter account, I guess, which I intend to do at some point. But in the meantime, that's where you can find me. Now, to begin, for a bit of background on Michels, Michels became a fascist after he wrote this. He actually joined the fascist party, but fascism wasn't even invented yet. This book came out in 1911. He was a socialist, a German socialist who ended up moving to Italy, joined the ranks of the Italian socialist movement, and kind of followed the path of mutation as the fascist movement mutated out of the Italian socialist movement, a decade after this was written. So you can see the importance of this text. Not only does it stand in elite theory in relation to particularly Mosca and Pareto's innovative works of the late 19th, early 20th century, it stands amongst those works, but also it has this sociological critique of socialism that you can kind of see as being an intellectual foundation for the mutation to post-socialist ideologies such as fascism that it kind of prefigures. So for that reason, I think it's quite interesting. But what he's doing here is a sociological critique of democracy, specifically focused upon the organizational structure of political parties themselves and what this implies. And that's his focus here. And he says, basically, the role of the sociologist is to give an analysis of the situation as it is, not necessarily make prescriptions about what to do. So what he wants to give us here is a description. And it's, in a sense, if you're a socialist, it's a black pill. It's a black pill for socialism. It shows, in a sense, the impossibility of socialism, at least in its more romanticized forms, in its more classical forms, and its Marxian forms, and so forth. Now, for Michels, there is an inherent tendency in party organization towards oligarchy due to the dynamics of specialization and bureaucratization, producing a technical elite which necessarily controls the processes involved in political party administration. Now, there's more dynamics to this than just this, but this is what essentially the argument builds towards over the entire text. He saw a new ruling class forming as a kind of technocracy over the political process, despite any ideological pretensions from liberal and particularly socialist parties. They represented the will of the people. A collective will for Michels requires organization in order to express itself or be produced in the first place, and this very organization cannot itself be democratic. Therefore, it is a technical and mechanical impossibility for Michels. That's really like the kind of core of his argument. The reason for this is that there is a necessity for representation, as there's no viable means for equally including a gigantic body of participants in a decision-making process. And so delegation is inescapable, and the process of selecting delegates itself requires organization and specialization, hence the formation of political parties in the first place. So an entire industry of sorts of specialists has formed around political party administration, as well as strategizing, policymaking, campaigning, etc. And if you don't have these specialists in your party machine, you simply can't compete with those that do. Now, it's very clear as well that Michel subscribes to Clausewitz's concept that politics is war by other means, and he sees the party machine as engaged in political warfare with the enemy. And so this imposes a certain tactical arrangement. This imposes a certain strategic environment the party is embedded within. And that becomes very important as we go on. But also this more fundamental process of professionalization, credentialism, the production of experts that come to dominate the party. This is the key. The more complex the political process becomes organizationally, the more alienated, therefore, this technical elite become from the party's rank and file members, and you have rule by committee. And so, what Michels describes here is the formation of a ruling political class out of technical necessity, essentially to replace the aristocracy of the old world, which itself was the product of the technical necessities of rule in its day. And this technocracy is essentially the new aristocracy then. And so what he's saying here, therefore, is that a kind of managerialism, he doesn't use this term, but a kind of managerialism rises through the socialist movement to overcome the old world, whether it be the old world aristocracy or the kind of bourgeois capitalist liberalism. Rule by committee is the mechanical necessity of political organization in the modern world. Michels quotes Rousseau on this point to demonstrate that the greatest theorist on popular sovereignty agrees with him. Quote from Rousseau, permanent representation will always be tantamount to the exercise of dominion by the representatives over the represented. But his difference with Rousseau is, however, that he sees no alternative. For Rousseau, he believed democracy could be preserved in the popular assembly, but for Michels, a technical leadership is required to compete in modern politics. Without it, it is like trying to fight a mechanized army with pre-industrial weapons. You'll just get smoked on the battlefield. Michels also describes how this dynamic becomes a moderating force as the political class which emerges distinguishes itself from the ruled classes it allegedly represents. Politics becomes more of a game to maintain status or market share, if you will, within the so-called political industry than an ideological mission. Supporters come to identify with demagogues and personal political struggles and parliamentary team sports, if you will, and the ideological project is lost within a web of pragmatic compromises to maintain quote-unquote electability, keep donors happy, retain status, etc. So the bureaucratization of the party structure implies the bureaucratization of the state itself, and this complexifying and expansionist organization of the state itself produces these same processes of specialization, expert leadership, and so on. And so a reduction of the state apparatus to a status allocation process rather than an ideological force in society is kind of mirrored by the political party's organization, which is kind of like a state within a state. And these organizational requirements of the state and the party kind of produce this vicious cycle of mutually organizing one another in this fashion. Quote, like every centralizing system, bureaucracy finds its justification in the fact of experience that a certain administrative unity is essential to the rapid and efficient conduct of affairs. And so you could say a term that I use for this view that Michels was putting forward here is technocratic realism, in the vein of Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, that his whole point is it becomes impossible in his view to think beyond the structure of capitalism for socialists. And so socialism has become this impossible project. Michels seems to be making an argument here far better than Mark Fisher's argument, a far more technical argument, that it's impossible for socialist practice to evade the production of technocracy. Michels sees this force of technocratic oligarchy imposed upon modern politics by the need for organization, administration, and strategy as enabled and exacerbated by the apathy of the masses and their need for guidance, coupled with the psychological impact of political leadership upon those who attain it. And so their investment in their personal status comes to override their concern with the ideological mission. And so we have these other two elements, the psychology of the mass and the psychology of the elite, the political elite, that exacerbate these technical and mechanical and strategic dynamics that he kind of lays out, and they all kind of fuse together. He also describes this process of embourgeoisement, which is recruitment into the socialist movement of so-called petty bourgeois intellectuals or elements, coupled with the organization of labor and socialist parties producing a petty bourgeois leadership of its own, which renders the left's political class alienated from the proletariat experience, whether it be an exit from the proletarian of this emerging political elite or the kind of transplant from outside of the proletarian into the socialist movement of leadership. The same process occurs. Politics becomes a profession in itself, and this profession engenders an upper middle class lifestyle, and this creates a petty bourgeois managerialism, which is a fake socialism, if you will, insofar as the proletariat has no real political agency, and socialism is supposed to be essentially the political will of the proletariat dominating the political system. An obvious example of this recently in Victoria, a state in Australia, there were massive protests a few months ago because the labor unions signed up with the corporations of the workers they represented to impose vaccine mandates upon the workers they represent. And the workers were like, what is this? You're supposed to be fighting for our interests, defending us from having rules imposed upon us, and instead you sell us out. Because the labor union elite are a bunch of intellectuals that have political science and sociology degrees that actually don't have any connection to the working man. They aren't actually workers. They don't rise from the proletariat, but they are imposed upon it from the academic managerial state apparatus. And so they align with the academic managerial agenda of the ruling technocracy. So Marxism's so-called sublation of class for Michels is an impossible delusion because the ruled class cannot also do away with the ruling class. It can only support the ascension of a new one in the place of the old, namely a petty bourgeois technocracy in the place of the bourgeois liberal order of the 19th century. Quote, thus the Socialist Party gives a lift to a certain strata of the working class. The more extensive and more complicated its bureaucratic mechanism, the more numerous are those raised by this machine above their original social position. It is the involuntary task of the Socialist Party to remove the proletariat, to deproletarianize the most capable and informal of its members. This new political class status alters the social consciousness of the ex-proletarian ascending elite of the socialist movement, de-radicalizing them from the class antagonism which drives the revolutionary tendency in Marxist theory. Compelling synthesis, I think, here with Veblen and Schumpeter's theories of capitalism tending towards socialism due to the technostructure of business organization. Essentially, the theory in Veblen, which we discussed earlier video, Owen and I watched my video on Veblen's theory of business enterprise. Veblen details how the financialization of capitalist ownership exteriorizes capitalists from the actual administration of industry. Business and industry become alienated from one another. Ownership becomes essentially exchanging quantified units of ownership in the stock market, and the actual running of industry is done by a managerial technostructure. Those managers may have, shares in the corporation, but ultimately their management becomes totally alienated from ownership. And so for Veblen, this would end up producing a tension in capitalism as this emergent managerial elite within the technostructure views itself as a distinct class with distinct interests that diverge from the interests of the capitalists. And the 20th century, in many ways, was a kind of contest between these two forces. Veblen was very influential upon American progressivism, informed some of the chief economic intellectuals of American progressivism, such as Galbraith. Galbraith worked for FDR, for JFK in their administrations. You see this with, the New Deal reforms and so forth, as well as, in a more extreme way with things like fascism and National Socialism and communism, where the relation of capital ownership to the management of industry is radically transformed. Anyway, so this is interesting as what Veblen and Schumpeter are describing. And you can also watch my series on Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which is pertinent here. They both describe capital being forced to produce a technical class which displaces them, the managerial elite. And here, what Michels is describing is labor. Organized labor having itself to produce a technical class which displaces their agency, the managerial elite. And so both capital and labor are being displaced by the technical elite, which administers their own control. And so this is an interesting dynamic when you fuse these two theories together. We also did another review on this channel of Gottfried's After Liberalism, and I want to in future do a review of Sam Francis, his book Leviathan and Its Enemies. These two theorists, these paleocon theorists, describe the emergence of the managerial elite in the 20th century, which Michels is, he's writing in the early 1911. This book comes out before we see the full emergence of this. But it's interesting placing all these theories together, seeing this force, the production of this managerial technocracy from different angles. Now, he does briefly discuss an antidote to this in Bakunin's concept of déclassement, or declassification in English, the rejection of material status intentionally by radical political actors to preserve and demonstrate their integrity. Michels doesn't believe this can actually work. A status is not merely economic, but social. And this is where he breaks from Marx. He rejects the Marxist reduction of everything to economic relations. This is why he's a sociologist, not just a political economist. So because status is social, there's no way for party leaders to surrender social status. It is a natural consequence of leading the party, and therefore there's no way around this. And he criticizes this romanticism held usually by anarchist-type idealists as just totally impractical and having no relation to how shit actually works. Quote, in the democratic parties of today, the great conflicts of view are fought out to an ever-diminishing extent in the field of ideas and with weapons of pure theory. They therefore degenerate more and more into personal struggles and invectives to be settled finally upon considerations of a purely superficial character. So the party becomes focused simply upon electoral success and securing new members, rather than radical goals of genuine social transformation. Parties organize elections, not social change. They are inherently conservative forces then for Michels. Now again, there is a kind of missing analysis here of managerial social engineering, but the book was written in 1911. But nevertheless, this is a very interesting point. This is the beginning of what they call now moderation theory. In order to commandeer the state, the party must mirror its bureaucratic organization, which I said before, and it must therefore then affirm upon a seizure of power the bureaucratic organization of the state. And so the party and the state enter into this symbiotic relationship of conserving one another within a status quo. Quote, the logical consequence of these considerations is in direct conflict with the hopes entertained by the founders of the party. Instead of gaining revolutionary energy as the force and solidity of its structure has increased, the precise opposite has occurred, a continued increase in the prudence, the timidity even, which inspires its policy. The party, continually threatened by the state upon which its existence depends, carefully avoids everything which might irritate the state to excess. Organization becomes the vital essence of the party. And so the party comes to exist for its own stake, status for the sake of status, and it de ideologizes, if you will. Now, I'm going to bring in AA because towards the end, he again makes reference to Mosca's concept of the political class. AA and I actually on Academic Agent's channel a few weeks ago, we did one of his cigar streams on Mosca's The Political Class, which is very influential in this text. And so go check that out if you're interested. And Mosca's whole point is that there's always a dominant minority that must rule necessarily. And so this fits in very well with what Michels ultimately deems his iron law of oligarchy, which is essentially who says organization says oligarchy. So the organization of these so-called, democratic socialist parties that are supposed to be about representing the masses, the workers, and so forth, the necessities of bureaucracy, the technical necessities, the tactical necessities of organization produce an elite, a technical elite that contests with the pre-established elite for control. But because of the bureaucratization of society, the specialization and centralization of administration, we are just swapping one dominant minority for another. And the only agency that can be built up to challenge a ruling class is a rival ruling class. This is Pareto's concept of the circulation of elites, which I hope Academic Agent will get into in his remarks, but I'll bring him in here.
Thanks a lot, Joel. Thanks for having me. Just one very quick thing to note about what you were saying about Samuel T. Francis and Paul Gottfried. I think the missing link between Michels and them is James Burnham, of course, who not only wrote a book called The Machiavellians, where he covers the elite theorists and Sorel and a few other people as well. He also wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution in 1943. And so you can see Burnham taking Michels to his logical conclusion and spotting this same tendency that Schumpeter spotted as well. I think Schumpeter in that book that you mentioned, was it 1942? I think it was. Schumpeter as well was influenced by the elite theorists, especially Pareto. So so I would say Burnham is central to that managerial thesis. In terms of Michels' relationship to the other elite theorists, he was a fair bit younger than both Mosca and Pareto. I think Pareto was 10 years older than Mosca. Mosca was 18 years older than Michels. So, that's quite an age difference if you think about it. So he knew Pareto from his time in Paris. They were part of this circle that met up and talked about Sorel. Sorel was kind of in that. We're talking about the decade between, the first decade of the 20th century. What do you call that decade? Like 1900s, say. He, when he was a young man, he was hanging out in all of these intellectual circles in Paris. There were quite a few people. I did a stream on Wyndham Lewis last night, and it turns out like Wyndham Lewis hung out in this same kind of milieu. And he kept a correspondence with Pareto about Sorel. They were both really into Sorel, especially his idea of myth and his focus on action and violence as opposed to various other things. Um, but then he got a job, I think, or he went to study in Turin, where he met Mosca. Mosca basically didn't really travel. He was much less kind of cosmopolitan than the other two, and just stayed in and around Italy his whole life. And he was at the University of Turin, where Michel studied, and then he taught. Um, and Mosca seems to have taken a shine to Michels, despite the fact that Michels was a socialist, as Joel mentioned. Um, you know, they were into some kind of similar ideas. Just put it that way. And obviously, Mosca was the premier elite theorist. Um, and so strong was this influence on Michels by Mosca. Various scholars have described him as like a mentor-like figure. Um, yeah, he's been described as Mosca's pupil, Mosca's disciple. These are all like various different academics I'm quoting here, like Etienne A. Albertini, Richard Bellamy, and Geraint Parry. These are all like quotes from these guys. Um, Now, this put Michels in kind of a tricky spot because it's well known that Mosca and Pareto didn't like each other. Mainly, the problem was Mosca believed that he deserved credit for being the originator of the theory of the elites. Pareto, who, like I said, was 10 years older and a world famous economist. Um, Therefore, he was like a kind of superstar academic, if that makes any sense. Um, he didn't acknowledge this. He didn't acknowledge Mosca as the originator. Um, and So much so, I think Pareto's got a note somewhere saying, listen, it's ridiculous that Moscow wants credit for this. Anybody with half a brain cell, it's been known for decades there's a ruler in the rule. Or sort of, so he was very dismissive, and this made Moscow bitter. And then later on, Mussolini, like Pareto, he didn't bother with Moscow. So there was kind of like ego stuff involved. And this put Michels in a kind of tricky spot because he knew both of them. He counted them both as kind of intellectual mentors, and in political parties, he takes elements. So the more practical and technocratic elements in political parties is really the Mosca side of things, and then the more psychological considerations, which he talks about, is the more kind of Pareto side. Pareto's interested. Pareto contends ultimately everything's downstream of these sentiments, these almost like animals instincts that we have. Um, whereas Mosca's analysis is much more technical, I guess. He's talking about just the raw practicalities of power. Um, so Michels kind of fuses these two things together, and because of this, because of the fact that Michels was always very deferential to both Mosca and Pareto, and he acknowledges them, and he kind of, you know, declared himself as a protege, if you want. In the secondary literature, and there's vast, many books written on the elite theorists and articles and things like that. The uh, Michels is always seen as like the least of the three. He's always talked about as the least original, and originality is not his strong point, and all this sort of stuff. Which and he kind of gets like short shrift in a way, which I think is a little bit unfair to Michel, because it doesn't really recognize what he's doing that's different. It suggests that everything in this is derivative of the other two, and that's not the case at all. So I think one of the things that we can think about is what he's doing that the other two weren't doing, and for me, it's like Pareto and Mosca are zoomed out. They're looking at the level of the state. They're saying there are elites and non-governing elites, and then there's the ruled. You know, but when they talk about the process of the circulation of elites, or they talk about the graveyard of aristocracies, um, it's all kind of automatic and taken for granted. And they're at such a level, they're at such a kind of 10,000 feet level of remove that you don't really know what that looks like. It's just kind of taken. It's just almost like a kind of the gears of history are grinding, and whereas Pareto gets really stuck in down at the ground level, he zooms in, um, and also he takes the analysis from the level of the state to smaller units of analysis. So rather than just the state, now it's the trade union, now it's the political party, now it's even a kind of fairly large company. Um, so his analysis is much more thoroughgoing in a way. He's not just saying that the state works like this. Any human organization conforms to the iron law of oligarchy. There's no escaping hierarchy. There's no escaping There's no escaping some of these technical considerations that he talks about. Um, and this, as Joel mentioned, basically puts paid to many naive, stupid, democratic ideas and socialist ideas that you could organize things in any other way. Um, and it has certain tendencies, which when he says conservative, he doesn't mean like ideologically or morally conservative. He means that you will by by playing this game of becoming a kind of technical bureaucrat um, or manager, you automatically start to attract the sort of people who care more about being respectable, who care more about their position, who care more about what Thomas Carlyle will call the gig man. The gig man. You start to attract gigmanity. The so not people like me and Joel who are motivated by ideas and get excited by it, but like professionals who don't really care who's paying their check at the end of the day, because it's all about their the skills that they bring to the table, um, and it's the archetype of the Adolf Eichmann guy. The I was just following orders type. The mundane face of the middle manager. And I mean, one of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that even though Michel sounds like he's covering quite dry material, I think Political Parties is quite a fun read. He really hates these people. He's got like a real contempt for these bureaucrats, and you can tell that he's speaking from experience. He was deeply involved in the German Social Democrat Party, and some of these movements, some of these uh, groups that he's talking about had memberships of up to like 3-4 million at one point. Um, and so he saw all of these things up close, and I think that gives I don't know, it gives a kind of immediacy to his analysis that rings true even today. He's writing in 1911, 1912, but you can recognize these things even if you've been involved with let's say you were part of the student union, right? You can see the mechanisms of the iron law of oligarchy play out even in something as seemingly um, innocuous and insignificant as a student union. So and these things are very important, I think, for any of us who want to think about political change. You have to come to terms with these sorts of realities that he's talking about. Um, Another thing I want to mention just before I hand over to Owen here is that I think one of the things I noticed in the literature, in the secondary literature, not only did they complain that he's unoriginal, which I think is an invalid, like, not even a complaint that we should care about. Like the question is not is he original, but is he talking is it true? Is it true? Is he recognizing something that's real here? And I think Michels is bang on with many of the things that he says. The other thing that they complain about is that why does he call it like he's a bit non-specific. He claims to be scientific, but actually he's not that scientific when he's kind of vague in his terms. And he calls it the iron law. Why is it not just a law? So one of the things I wanted to just mention in my little bit here Um, the reason it's an iron law is because there are I mean, Joel mentioned the five factors that you've got. You know, democracy is mechanically impossible, it's technically impossible, it's tactically impossible. Okay. And then on top of that, you get two psychological factors that he takes from Pareto and Gustave Le Bon and then other people like that, which is the psychology of the leader, the psychology of the elites, and then the psychology of the crowd. The crowd is seen as being this kind of almost kind of passive, feminine, pathetic entity that can't organize. You know, it's always passive. It's always looking for um, leaders. There's nothing it can do. Basically, it's useless. And this is something that I think people need to just accept. Um, and in fact, I think that the coup, the pandemic has made it abundantly clear that most people are just what we call NPCs, ready to be programmed. Basically, that you know, it is true that masses act like masses, um, and they are like this. They are passive. They are feminine. But then the flip side of it is that um, there's this kind of idea that as soon as you get a taste of power, regardless of your motivations for getting into whatever it is in the first place, you'll start to become seduced by the power itself and start caring more about maintaining your position than any kind of ideological considerations. And that is something that we see time and again as well. I mean, he was talking about socialists. He was talking about how basically any of the socialists who tasted power sold out, right? Um, they sold out their principles to maintain their respectability. But I think it's especially an issue on the right in 2021. How do you deal with this? I constantly battle with what I call the Tory boys, but this is the issue, right? Everybody, right, whether they're coming from the left or the right, everybody basically once they join up to one of these organizations, if it gets established, if it becomes part of the status quo, then you get the Tory boy problem. You start attracting that sort of person, and it seems to be like an intractable issue. Um, and then yes, I think that was. Where else was I going with that? Oh yeah. The final thing I wanted to say is that the reason it's an iron law is because you have these five factors, and um, you need to defeat all five of them to break the law. Okay. So let's just pretend you got you solve this problem of the crowd being supine and leaders being like corruptible. Okay. You actually had the perfect platonic leaders, and you had I don't know, you had like a crowd of people who had like perfect information. Okay. You still have the problem of the mechanics, just the practical factors of organization that he talks about. You have the technical issue to deal with, and you have and then you have the tactical issue to deal with. So you need to like resolve all five of them, and that is, I mean, it's practically impossible. That's why it's the iron law of oligarchy. Um, and then the final thing I wanted to say is that one of the things I appreciate about Michels, and one of the things that annoys political scientists, writing in journals and things like that, is that they complain that he's a little bit messy, right? He claims to be scientific, but there are five factors here, not just one. But I think that um, he's never monocausal. He's always saying, well, actually, there are 4 or 5 different reasons this is happening. I think that's a strength. Whereas a lot of people want I guess like logical neatness. They want him to say no, this one is prime, or it's just this one thing. And that's been one of my bugbears in academia in general, where somebody has a thesis, and then they want everything to conform to that one idea and that one cause. I mean, I mentioned this the other day. Jared Diamond is an example, right? There, the idea that geography and environment would shape how human society develop is good, right? It's not bad. It makes sense. It has explanatory power. But Diamond wants it to explain everything, like absolutely everything that has ever happened in history, and this is a problem that I think affects. I think it's to do with the individual incentives of scholars within academe. Anyway, I've spoken for long enough.
Most of my notes deal with the second half of this book, so I'll just very briefly go over the first half. Essentially, in the first half of the book, Michels is showing like structurally why liberal democracy fails in its stated intention, which originally the idea of the liberal democracy was to replace monarchy, to replace various forms of hereditary aristocracy with like popular sovereignty, like rule by the people, no inherent hierarchy, just a society based on consensus of the majority and a structure in which anyone based on skill and popular appeal could rise to the top. And the argument Michels puts forward throughout most of this book is that that's just fundamentally impossible. What you have in liberal democracy is actually still just as much an aristocracy, except now it's an aristocracy of bureaucrats and technical managers who present a sort of a facade of democratic or progressive values to conceal what they're actually doing. Early on, he applies this with reference to conservative parties, where conservative parties in their worldview and their ideological understanding of things are explicitly more aristocratic and favorable towards hierarchy. But the nature of the liberal democracy is such as that they can't put themselves forward as that, so they need to present themselves as being progressive and present themselves as being populist and even in a certain sense revolutionary, with why you see phenomenon even today where like the American Republican Party will say that it's actually more progressive and less racist and more tolerant than the left. The American right will say these things. But for much of the book, he's actually focusing more on the Socialist Party, in part because he has socialist sympathies himself, and in part because the Socialist Party, ideologically at least, is the one that's most committed to the democratic ideal. It's the one that's the most opposed to hierarchy, to oligarchy, to managerial elites. And yet you see the same phenomenon occurring with leftist parties, with socialist parties. And what Michels wants to do is, to show that these oligarchic tendencies emerge inevitably, even in the parties that are ostensibly most opposed to oligarchy, because this law of oligarchy is something that just structurally inevitably occurs as a result of trying to organize a large number of people in order to get something done. Inevitably, you're going to have a managerial elite who become increasingly detached from the rest of the population. And this has nothing to do with the elite being evil or having some sort of special power or having some sort of historical luck that allowed them to seize power and retain it indefinitely. Rather, it's just a simple scientific law of human organization, similar to a triangle having three sides. Organization leads to oligarchy inevitably. Sorry, I have a cold. So he talks quite a bit about that in the first half of the book, the structural tendencies that lead to these sorts of things. In the second half of the book, he gets more into the psychology of the individual, the psychology of class relations, specifically in the socialist sense, but also how this oligarchic tendency creates and recreates endlessly class structure and class strata, and how these class strata are more complex than the simple Marxian view of the bourgeois versus the proletariat. So basically, I'm just going to bring up my notes here. One moment. You see this oligarchic tendency initiated by the need for organization, but it's accelerated by basic tendencies of human nature. On the one hand, you have the masses who, as academic agents said, are by nature apathetic and unable to do anything. This is just a biological tendency of human beings. When you have a large group of people, without someone overseeing them, they are basically organized by the lowest common denominator. They're irrational, they're easy to manipulate, and it's difficult to get them to coordinate in any fashion. So if you have a large mass of people, such as any large modern civilization or any large modern political party, they need someone to guide them. And on the other hand, you have leaders who have a natural, again, this is just a basic human tendency, a natural lust for power and an enjoyment of ruling over others. So this initially could begin, someone becomes a leader, let's say they rise up from the working class. Initially they become detached from the masses for idealistic reasons. It's usually they get put into a leader role because they are more willing to make sacrifices to do the difficult work of being a leader. They have a clearer vision of what the party stands for. They are more passionate about the cause of socialism or whatever the party is, and they have a genuine desire for good. But because of this, they become removed from everyone else. They get into this position after a long struggle to do something in the name of a cause, and once they're in that position, they're disinclined to ever give it up. I mean, it's something they've obtained as a result of struggle, and it would take a truly a Christ-like individual, basically, to be able to sacrifice something that they had worked hard for their whole lives for some greater ideological good. So when someone's gotten into a leadership position, they become aware of the fact that the masses are apathetic. They won't get anything done for themselves. They require guidance. They recognize that the reason why they're in this position is because they have a certain degree of superiority. Sorry. And this all contributes to awaken a spirit of command within them. Furthermore, once they've been in this position of leadership for a while, they're ill-equipped to do anything else. And this is something that Michels gets into in the first half of the book, is that once you're placed in a leadership position, you start to become trained in the technical mechanisms of the party. Your worldview begins to shift from what it was formerly. A leader who emerged from the working class, let's say they were a skilled trade worker, now when they're in the leadership position of the Socialist Party, they're no longer applying themselves to their trade. They're studying political minutiae all day. They lose their mechanical abilities. If a leader emerges from, say, the sciences, they lose track of how their field is progressing. So basically, wherever in the world the leader emerged from initially, once they're in the leadership role, that's consuming all of their time, all of their energy. They lose whatever other skills they had, and they become personally only able to act as a leader. Along with this, there's a tendency over a sufficient period of time, once you've been exposed to all of the daily struggles and the dull mundanities of overseeing a large political organization, the contrivances, there's a tendency for your idealism to wane. Your old romantic idealistic vision from youth that initially motivated you to get involved in this political cause is gradually replaced with just the day-to-day struggle of power games. So inwardly, most leaders after a sufficient period of time are quite estranged from whatever cause it was that initially motivated them, say socialism, even though outwardly they still need to put on this facade of being the faithful comrade, being the idealistic, self-sacrificing hero that the masses need, because the masses have a religious need to look up to someone great. This is, again, another human tendency. So they present themselves this way outwardly, but internally they increasingly become skeptics, they become materialists, they become guided by cold calculation. This varies from individual to individual, obviously. In many cases, they see this personal transformation as really just a maturing process. They become aware of the complexities of the situation, and they had to overcome some of their old idealism in order to more realistically assess the actual possibilities. But what this translates to practically is that they become a bureaucrat. And likewise, people typically tend to be more moral, more ideologically driven during struggle, during difficulty, when you are the oppressed group, when you're on the bottom rung of society, and you have this great tyrannical force from your perspective that you're fighting against. That's quite romantic. That's quite ideologically motivating. As soon as you've started to gain some control, either as a social force or even just individually, there's a decline in moral conviction. And you see this especially with socialist leaders who rise up from the working class, where even though by and large the working class is still fighting for its rights, the individual who becomes a leader is themselves somewhat ascended. They become bourgeois somewhat themselves. So personally, they have less of that fire. They have less of that deep burning need to overcome oppression, because their own day-to-day reality is that they themselves are living much better than they were initially. So psychologically, logically, they might still understand the struggle, but personally, emotionally, it's no longer the case for them. So from here, he gets into the phenomenon of how this originated. He looks quite a bit at the French Revolution, at what he calls Bonapartism. And this section of the book is very similar to the Juveniles on Power, where you see during the French Revolution the emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte, who personifies himself as a leader of the people, who is doing things in the name of the people, who is entirely motivated by the will of the people. And this is basically what you see throughout the modern mass democracy, is this framing of the ruling elites as simply being the tools of the masses. And this leads to a number of interesting psychological phenomenon. Once the leader personifies themselves as just the voice of the majority, he's able to frame any resistance to his will as being anti-democratic, as being against the people. He's able to exterminate his adversaries in the name of the people. He's able to justify any sort of repressive measure he wants to use, any sort of force, any sort of concentration of authority into his own hands as being the will of the people, because the people voted him into office. He's able to crush any sort of opposition group as being against the people. He's able to take any sort of popular movement and isolate it. And so in this way, you can have a small minority, a single individual perhaps, who is able to frame himself as being the voice of the majority, and to take what might actually be a majority opposition and to break it up into these isolated groups and to defeat them in the name of the masses. So, and also because of this, it makes it so that anyone who's a middleman, anyone who is a bureaucrat in the power system, is required to pledge allegiance to the centralizing force, because if they don't, then they also are going against the people. So it's a very consensus breeding process. And once it's got going, it's very difficult to end this, because in theory, if the people could vote for anything, they could vote to end popular sovereignty. They could vote to return to a formal monarchy, to an explicit aristocracy. But even this is kind of ruled out from the get-go, because in theory you could have one generation that votes to end popular democracy, but this would be seen as being unjust to future generations. So there's this kind of compulsion to maintain popular democracy in the name of the future, right? So, like, the only thing that popular sovereignty can't do is end itself. But basically, this process gives the masses the illusion of being in charge, which makes them submit more readily to power because it's framed as being a power they enacted themselves. Again, another de Juvenilean point that's made here is that in the monarchy, to disobey the monarch is to sin against God because the monarch's been appointed by God. Within a democracy, to disobey the democracy is to sin against the people. The leader bases his right to command on the supposed omnipotence of the people, quote unquote. But really, the people have very little power. They have the power to, let's say in America, go to the polls every 4 years and pick one of two choices to rule over them. And their choice is heavily informed by media manipulation, by selective framing of the issues, by the fact that the average person just has a very weak understanding of politics by necessity, because it's a very complex subject, and most people, they have their personal lives to attend to. They don't have time to become political specialists. So the actual participation of the individual in the democratic process is basically just entirely illusory. From where does he go from here? He talks about how bureaucrats within the party will use various manipulative tactics. He will confound his own interests with the interests of the party. When the party is criticized, he'll take it as a personal attack. Whereas when he is personally criticized, he will frame it as an attack on the party. He say it's ideologically driven. He will frame his opponent as an enemy of the party, and basically get all of the party adherents on board with defending his personal will as if it were the ideological tenets of socialism or whatever it is he claims to represent. And this has a certain purpose because, again, as Michels has lined up in the first half of the book, in order to be an efficient political bureaucracy, in order to actually get things done, the more dictatorial you are, the more you can actually achieve. This is, again, just a scientific law of large group organization. But it does lead to problems because the bureaucrat typically thinks that he understands the masses better than they do themselves. He introduces a conservative tendency where he resists anyone that opposes his will. But at the end of the day, even though he is a skilled bureaucrat and he has quite a few technical capabilities, he is just one man. And the fact of the matter is that he might be in the wrong. He might be on the wrong side of history. Certainly, in many cases, he'll be on the wrong side of popular opinion. So he's able to resist what might otherwise be a natural evolution of society because he personally has a particular vision and he's gotten in this position of power and he's able to maintain certain stratifications much longer than they would have endured otherwise. And this is something he gets into when he talks about the stratification of class society, and he does kind of frame this in terms of the typical socialist idea of the bourgeois and the proletariat, where the proletarian masses are slow to react to social change, and they'll typically endure worn-out conditions long after their expiry date, because the class representing the elite ruling forces of a previous era, in this case the bourgeois, are able to maintain a certain moral prestige and a certain political force long after the point where they've actually stopped representing the most powerful material force in society. And because of this, the masses, who do, in the socialist view, represent the most powerful material force in society, are unable to actually ascend and take control of society until forces from the higher classes help them to do this. Basically, the masses by themselves are just instinctual, they're disorganized, they don't fully understand the situation. What they require is members of the bourgeois to organize them, to scientifically, theoretically, politically, ideologically guide them. And this is for a number of reasons. If you think back, like when this book was written over 100 years ago, University education was much less common. It was really only members of the upper classes who had a deep understanding of philosophy, of political tactics, of history, etc., etc. So bourgeois dissenters who joined the working class movements were able to provide a sort of theoretical foundation to what was previously just like an instinctual compulsion. But beyond this, the very fact that members of the bourgeois would turn to socialism gives it a sort of objective weight. Because socialism is something that is disadvantageous to their class strata, right? Like within the socialist worldview, the bourgeois are basically going to get a bad hand. They're going to lose their advantage. And the fact that certain members of the bourgeois, of the upper class, begin to see the ideological validity of socialism suggests there's something more to it than simple greed of the proletarian. He gets into why a member of the bourgeois might be compelled to go into socialism. Basically, there's just a disgust with the unending struggle, the ongoing sense of a violent revolution brewing. There's this need for sort of an idealistic vision that can be shared by everyone. And in general, there's this feeling that no one wants to live amongst a ruined society, right? Like, you might be a member of the bourgeois, but if 90% of society has just fallen totally into despair, that limits somewhat your ability to enjoy life, your ability to, envision a long-term future for your society. And this is a key component of social revolution for Michels, is this idea that once the ruling classes begin to lose faith in their own ideological vision, so the bourgeois vision, it signifies the onset of their own political decay. Once they begin to hear the validity of their adversaries' arguments, that signifies the ascent of the new class, in this case, the proletarian uprising. Now, this has its limits, right? There's this idea within socialism that they want to persuade the bourgeois of the validity of their ideological position, the socialist position. And this will work on individuals, certain individuals of a poetic or perhaps a self-sacrificing sentimental mindset will be won over to the socialist cause. But a class as a whole will not be won over. A class as a whole, again, is kind of like a crowd. It's not driven by ideological ideals. It's driven by economic determinism. A ruling class will not just voluntarily give up its position of privilege. Individuals of that class might, certain members of the bourgeois might become leaders of the socialist movement, but the class as a whole will not just voluntarily destruct itself. So anyway, where does he go from here? He talks about the different kinds of proletarian leadership, the different motivations that there would be, how these groups are not homogenous, how there is a bourgeois element within the proletariat. You have certain proletarians who become petty bourgeois themselves, become shopkeepers who basically parasitically live off the proletarian by demanding that their comrades support them in business, that they buy their inferior products, that they shop local, etc., etc. Was there any other key points I wanted to make, though? I think you guys have covered most of what I wanted to say. I'm just going to go check to see if there was any. Okay, so at the end of the book, after he's established the inability of a true democracy to be established, how once, even if a socialist party came into power, it wouldn't be able to instill true democracy. At best, it could just become this massive party bureaucracy that could incorporate more and more of the population into the mechanism of the party in order to give them a somewhat elevated social position. His ultimate conclusion, because he does come off as being pro-democracy in theory, is that there's still some validity in fighting for democracy, even if it's like this impossible ideal to realize. Because in theory, the ideal form of human structure would be as if you had an aristocracy that was genuinely just the most competent and the most moral segment of society. If you had your perfect AI or your alien race that was like above petty human concerns, or if God himself came down out of heaven and ruled over Earth, this would be the ideal, but that doesn't occur in the real world. Very rarely you might have a great king or something, but eventually he dies and he passes it down to his son, and it's unlikely that the son will be as good as his father. So forgetting that like idealistic impossibility, what Michels ultimately concludes is that there is some validity in endlessly fighting for democracy, even if it's impossible to realize. Because in the fight for democracy, you stave off some of the worst authoritarian tendencies of aristocracy, and by striving to elevate the general education level of the masses, you do promote a degree of democratic inclination. So he sees it basically as this endless kind of struggle between aristocracy and democracy, where neither one totally wins out. But it's a struggle worth continuing because as long as you're fighting for democracy, if you are a pro-democratic individual, you don't necessarily ever achieve it, but you might be able to improve the situation. So that's more or less some of the basic points I had. So I'm gonna pass it back to you guys now.
Okay, so what I found that was interesting was that third section or fourth section of the book where he talks about Bonapartism. He interestingly he kind of describes Bonapartism or Caesarism with a certain amount of contempt and cynicism, even though he does also describe, well, we kind of have this bureaucracy that forms, and it becomes about people defending their status within this established institutionalized structure. And so if we have the Caesar that can take his mandate directly from the people and rule with an iron fist, the strongman, the populist dictator, if you will, he can shake things up. He can make radical change because he rules with an extreme amount of legitimacy. And obviously, this is very similar to Mussolini and the whole fascist ideology, the concept that the national will, like in the philosophy of Giovanni Gentile, the whole concept that the national will becomes personalized in this spiritual avatar, which is the leader of the state, namely Mussolini. So it's very interesting that his view moved because it definitely seems like it's incompatible with the sentiment that he lays out in this text. I haven't read anything else by Michel. I haven't read any of his later writings, his justification for his conversion to fascism. I find it interesting, though, that there is that departure, whether it was a cynical departure of, well, this is just like the best of the alternatives, or whether his thought genuinely developed from this text.
Yeah, I don't actually know. I haven't been able to find any kind of anything on that for various different reasons. Obviously, people working on Michels, you know, after 1945, they either want to save these thinkers from the charge of being fascists. So you get all of these kind of like hilarious kind of cope articles. Well, actually, Michels really was pro-democracy. There's tons of articles like that saying actually, actually this, if you really, really understand what he's saying, he's actually for democracy, guys. So you get quite a lot of articles along those sorts of lines. But I haven't really. I mean, as far as I can understand it, he basically black-pilled himself into being a fascist. Um, you know, there is that one passage on the I don't know if it's in the Bonapartist section, but he basically talks about how when he's talking about the psychology of the crowd, that the you basically need what does he write? I've got the exact quote here. He says, "The most striking proof of the organic weakness of the mass is furnished by the way in which, when deprived of the leaders in time of action, they abandon the field of battle in disordered flight. They seem to have no power of instinctive reorganization and are useless until new captains arise capable of replacing those that have been lost. So you'd think with that sort of and to me, by the way, one of the things that I found reading it this time is how many of these things I recognize in contemporary politics. Like that really reminded me of January the 6th. You know, uh, deprived of leaders in a time of action. I don't want to talk about I don't want to do rank punditry, but the image of Donald Trump like sneaking off on his helicopter when his crowd needed him, and then look at the absolute state of the masses when there's no organizational principle there, if that makes any sense. They literally got to the Capitol and it's Big Deleska taking selfies of him, taking pictures of himself. So yeah, I find it interesting that he ends up as not just a Mussolini supporter, like a card carrying member of the fascist party. Even Pareto didn't go that far. In fact, Pareto turned down various different things that were offered to him by Mussolini, and then he died, of course. Whereas Michels, as far as I can tell, was of the three elite theorists, the one who was he was fully on board. And it's especially interesting because Mussolini, I believe, you guys may know better than me, when he actually came to power, he stood in that square in Rome, and didn't he say, "I have come for one thing and one thing only. I want to lead. I want to be the leader." He didn't say, "I'm doing it for justice. I'm doing it for the people. I'm doing it." He just said, I want to be in charge," basically, which I find like almost you can almost see the influence of the elite theorists on Mussolini when he's so kind of nakedly transparent as to just kind of almost like demystify. You can talk about the myths he tried to erect afterwards, but I just think in that moment it's very rare for somebody to not obscure wanting power in some way. Usually there is at least a song. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Shakespeare's Richard III, but Richard III has this whole like charade where he gathers this crowd, and then he stands on a balcony and pretends to read the Bible. And they were like, "Oh, come on, we need somebody to be the king." And he was like, "I couldn't possibly. I'm a good holy man. I want to return to my studies. No, come on, we need somebody." He was like, "Okay, go on then, go on. I'll be the, if I must, I'll be the king." And you still see leaders do that whole charade because there needs to be some kind of um, you know appeal to sovereignty, if you want. But Mussolini just didn't do that. So
An interesting thing that I got reading this text is the historical context. Where as I'm reading it, and he's showing the inevitability of this sort of hierarchy formation, this elite strata, and how there's no getting around this. There is this like unspoken question I feel throughout, where it's like, well, if this is inevitable, why don't we just try making it explicit? Why don't we just run with it? Why don't we lean into it? And instead of like concealing it with all of this false, not even like well concealed, I feel like even the average person these days kind of at least has like an intuitive sense that democracy is like it's a facade. It doesn't really work. And like maybe most people still think that it could work, but there's definitely like an understanding that what we have isn't really a democracy. It's like a bureaucracy that kind of maintains its own interests. So I can certainly see like the Italian socialists who became the Italian fascists perhaps being inspired by this sort of material, reading it and saying like, well, what if we just went totally mask off? What if we just like made this really out in the open and direct, just removed all of this false ideological nonsense from like an older era, all of these like, early bourgeois liberal ideals that sounded good on paper but didn't really work out on practice? What if we just binned all of that and keep the actual mechanism of power that we've come to recognize more explicitly and see if perhaps that works a little bit better. And that's the feeling I got from reading this.
It fits into this overarching view, which I've been calling the state-centric theory of the political, which is in contrast to particularly Marxist views, but any kind of what I in my paper in third issue of my journal, Firstness, I talk about like the three fundamental sociological mistakes or social scientific mistakes that I see being made in general discourse, but on the dissident right. The three were the autocratic theory of government, like the idea that the person that's in charge of an institution somehow expresses full agency over that institution as opposed to other structural processes inherent to that institution. Economic determinism, like the idea that the formation of the elite, the formation of the political order is driven by economic incentives and economic classes, and the democratic theory of policy creation. Now, this is a very good refutation of the democratic theory of policy creation, but it also fits into this more overarching theme, I think, of rejecting economic determinism and autocratic theories of government, because what it demonstrates is that the ruling class, its production has shifted um, into this new form. That essentially what has occurred with modernity is that basically like political organization has changed. We've switched into this bureaucratic society, and bureaucracy is not just the state. I mean, all large corporations are bureaucracies. Like if you work for a large corporation and you have to deal with the HR department at some point, you know exactly what I mean. Um, so all large corporations are bureaucracies, political parties are bureaucracies. Any large institution necessarily develops this impersonal structure. And so the interaction between these institutions, what I call the institutional theory of society, this develops the overall structure of the political. And this is why I say the political is determined not by economic factors, but by security factors, in the sense that institutions exist necessarily in relation to other institutions. And so they have to reinforce themselves within the interinstitutional environment that makes up society. And obviously, the state being the kind of dominant sovereign central institution, although it itself is made up of many like sub institutions, like different bureaucratic departments or extra governmental organizations like NGOs or political parties or whatever. All these institutions exist in this complex interrelationship, and so they need to basically reinforce their position relative to one another. And this is kind of Michels' point, that once you develop a political party, its relation to the state, to other institutions in society, take over from whatever the ideological mission that originally set it up. Like we're going to have this critique of society. We're not happy with this. We're not happy with that. We want to make these social changes. But then, as it starts to develop, the whole point of the political party becomes securing itself in this interinstitutional relationship. It becomes security becomes its primary concern, or it's the kind of like retaining itself, which is what Michels calls the inherent conservative tendency within organization. And so this is interesting, I think, because as we shift from feudalism to modernity, generally the narrative goes we had feudal society, there was an aristocracy, there was the church, and then we have this process whereby, okay, we have the emergence of um, absolutist monarchs and capitalist elites. And so the absolutist monarch BTFOs the aristocracy and the church, and then leaves himself weak. So then he gets BTFO'd by the bourgeois elites. And now we live underneath the rule of, you know, finance capital or something. This is BS. Really, what you can see here is that these moves towards absolutism and bourgeois liberalism, or quote unquote capitalism, this isn't actually what's going on here. What's going on here is a move from um, the kind of aristocracy and the church forming the ruling class being replaced by academia and the new political elite, the new technocracy, coming to replace it. And the processes of capitalism and absolutist monarchy, these are just facades. These are images that appear on the outside like that. They're really what's going on, but actually there is a more fundamental shift in actually how the ruling class is being developed here, and they're just intermediary phases in this transition. And so, because that's key, because the absolutist monarchs, they derive their authority from massive bureaucracies and the development of academic structures. So, like, if you like, particularly with quote unquote enlightened absolutism, you see this with the British monarchy, where yeah, obviously they break, Henry VIII breaks from the Catholic Church, founds the Church of England, but more importantly, the Royal Society is established in by the British monarchy that justifies, that develops liberal political science, that develops literally people like Francis Bacon and so forth. I'm sorry, not Francis Bacon. um oh yeah, no, Francis Bacon and so forth.
Hmm.
They establish you know I mean, they take it from earlier British theologians like the nominalists. They take this empiricist uh angle to producing a kind of a new way of organizing academia outside of the church, a kind of secularized
You,
academia that produces independent political sciences and can give rise to ultimately a new political class. And so the monarch, in kind of overthrowing the church, he just replaces the church with academia, and ultimately academia produces a whole bunch of parliamentarian, anti-monarchic ideologies. Um, that end up basically cucking the monarchs. So this idea that like the absolutist monarchs were ever really in charge, it's an illusion. They were and the same thing with capitalism. The bourgeois elites come in and they take over from the old aristocracy. But ultimately, in order for them to set themselves up, they need to subordinate themselves to the production of this liberal democratic state. And then the liberal democratic states that get developed, that they support, they ultimately create these massive bureaucratic edifices that then socialists come into, and they start appropriating all of these resources from the economic system, and they start completely ripping apart the bourgeois values of the late 18th, early 19th century and building the modern world of like the mass, kind of like universalizing the franchise and um, bureaucratizing everything to build the modern bureaucratic state. And so Michels is a key theorist in this I think true alt narrative of how shit actually worked in terms of developing the modern political. And I put him up there with people like Juvenel, the other elite theorists, obviously, people that I cover on this channel, basically, as this kind of counter tradition to the kind of like dominant memes, so to speak, that are floating around that actually give you the truth about the political. So anyway, I'll throw it to you.
no, I was just going to say on Francis Bacon. I don't know if you're aware that he wrote this kind of utopian fiction called the New Atlantis.
Mm.
In fact, Thomas More wrote Utopia, and if you have a look at how Utopia functions, it's pretty technocratic. But Bacon's New Atlantis is very technical. He basically puts the scientists. It's like a kind of scientific theocracy, if that makes any sense. He puts the scientists in charge, and it's this it's this kind of technocratic state, which is very interesting. That is the way that he. In fact, it's not a million miles away from the system that we have now. It only I suppose in New Atlantis there wouldn't be a Congress or a president. It would just be like Dr. Fauci or something, just in charge.
Yeah, but that's what American progressivism was ultimately the realization of, was the self-awareness of this technical managerial elite in the American political system. And ultimately, the New Deal was them cucking, like having that final victory, that total victory over the bourgeois liberal order. That they already had victories building up to that, obviously, like from Teddy Roosevelt's administration, various other moves, things like the suffragette movement, the universalization of the franchise, um, and but like ultimately they commandeered uh, the economy and the total organization of the state. And this goes along with the World War, Second World War in particular, where you have total war where the entire bureaucratic organization of society has to be geared toward this industrial war effort that occurs across the world, not just in the United States, obviously. Um, Juvenal makes this point that this is like the awakening of the state, where you have this process that occurs as we kind of break out of medieval feudalism of competitive centralization, where the structure of these different states, they have no choice but to out centralize each other, otherwise they get BTFO'd by the states that do a better job.
Now, on the point of convergence within society, within let's say FDR's America or Britain or any other country, in my lecture, which is going to be in Foundations of Politics, I have a whole paragraph where I'm not really like critical, but I kind of think that this is an element that is missing in the elite theorists. Let me just read it to you and see what how you guys react. Okay, because you may well change my mind if you think I've missed something here. I say the value of Michels is in his many insights into practical on the ground politics and the realities of organization. His chief contribution is to see what Moscow and Pareto said on the level of whole countries is also true at the level of large organizations. However, because his analysis is focused on individual organizations in microcosm, he does not give us, crucially, the relationship between organizations or how leaders in one organization respond to leaders in external organizations who are no direct threat to them. Is the tendency of elites in disparate organizations to diverge in rivalrous competition or to converge as people with largely similar interests and goals? Recall, for example, Nick Clegg leaving the Liberal Democrat Party to join Facebook. I got a section earlier on where basically Michels is talking about, how once you enter into that kind of ruling class, you kind of work towards your own interests rather than the interests of the interests that kind of got you there. And the reason I use Nick Clegg is because he in 2010 he ran on an election pledge to abolish tuition fees. Even I voted for him back in 2010, right? But that was one of the reasons, because I wanted tuition fees to be gone at that time, and he basically the Tory party did not have have enough to form to form a government at that time. So there was this coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and one of the first things they did when they got in power is put up the tuition fees to £9,225. So he did the exact opposite of what he pledged to do once he was actually in power, which I thought was a very neat demonstration of Michels' point, that the myth of representative democracy is shown in the fact that these people almost never do, what they said they would, as soon as the realities of power kick in. Anyway, these questions would be left for James Burnham and Samuel T. Francis to flesh out, and we can return to them later. For now, I will say in passing that Mosca gives us the categories of feudal and bureaucratic with which to think about this problem on a state level. If large institutions in disparate fields, for example, a political party and a corporation, become more rivalrous, it is a sign of feudalization, which is to say competing power centers. If they are on the opposite trajectory to go towards convergence, we might say it is a sign of bureaucratization, or even, in Mosca's phrase, over bureaucratization. Michels provides a whole chapter himself on this topic called Bureaucracy, Centralization, and Decentralization Tendencies. But this offers no significant advance on Mosca and finds itself too bogged down in the minutiae of contemporary German socialist scene of 1911. He does complain entertainingly, however, about the problem of bureaucratic specialization leading to mundane career seeking, obsequious men who know nothing of bigger ideas or principles. Bureaucratization suppresses the individuality and gives the society in which employees predominate in a narrow, petty, bourgeois, and Philistine stamp. The bureaucratic spirit corrupts character and engenders moral poverty. Thus, within bureaucratization is a degenerative principle, degenerative in the general quality of the personnel who form the non-governing elite. And that could sow the seeds of a move towards decentralization by generating disaffected but more visionary types who agitate for change. And we can see in this something of Pareto circulation of the elites. And this is also the seed of an idea that would be dubbed bio-Leninism by the blogger Spandrel in 2018, whereby these key bureaucratic roles are filled based more on loyalty to the party than for their actual skills. In Michels' terms, what is really happening is they are weakening one of the key pillars on which the Iron Law depends, the practical abilities of the leaders to organize. If too many mundane specialists become toadying sycophants, then the advantage of the leaders is lost. So yeah, I wanted to read that because I thought it got into a few interesting things there. And I was wondering what you guys thought. Like, am I being a bit harsh on Moscow, on Michels, when and on Moscow indeed, when I say that they don't really give us this element of like, well, how are these disparate organizations interacting with each other?
I agree with you, but also, I mean, I guess things were a bit different in 1911, and he's focused on the socialist movement than it is now, where, I mean, in those days there was influence of um, non-government organizations, so to speak, but foundations and so forth. But I think this is something that really came online in a far more intense way in the 20th century, where there are all these other entities in the what I call the policy-making apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
You think about all the different entities around, like the Republican Party in the United States, like the Federalist Society that handles jurisprudence, and like the Heritage Foundation and the National Conservatism Conference that just happened the other day, and like the Claremont Institute, all these different groups that have different positions, the Cato Institute, so forth. There's heaps, right? There's just countless
Mm-hmm.
institutions. The kind of DC superstructure.
Yes.
Like these institutions, they are all separate, but they have to form a kind of orthodoxy. And there's I mean, obviously, like there are different factions, that are trying to pull the Republican Party in different directions. But uh, they still have to kind of get together and form an orthodoxy, a kind of policy orthodoxy that eventually becomes like the Republican Party's, policies. They're kind of well, obviously, if you're in like an actual congressman, you don't write the legislation. In most cases, you don't even read it. I remember like Rand Paul tried to put a bill through American Congress 10 years ago or so called the Read the Bill Act to kind of implore congressmen to actually read bills before they vote on them, and it failed. They don't want to actually read the stuff. They don't write it. They don't even read it, but they vote on it. So who's writing it? Someone. So there is this massive bureaucratic superstructure of different institutions that are producing this, producing these policies, and churning out the actual legislation and the agenda, and this legions of strategists and kind of election experts and focus group researchers and statistical analysts and all kinds of things that go into the massive political industry, and they're all trying to maintain their position within the GOP, and so they might have certain hostilities to one another. Different, like if there's two different institutions that are trying to pull, you can see right now with the Republicans, they're trying to push this kind of multiracial populist economic nationalism, as Steve Bannon calls it, and there's like the Claremont Institute guys, there's Tucker Carlson, there's Steve Bannon, there's a whole bunch of guys like this that are pushing um, Republican Party in this direction, but then there's also the Cato Institute guys that reject this and say, no, this is socialism. We need to have, so there are still these differences. So they're competing with one another, but then overall, like an orthodoxy has to form. They have to align themselves with an orthodoxy to get by. Otherwise, if they're existing in, like, if I create a think tank with radical, far right ideology, I'm not part of an orthodoxy, and so they're all just going to attack me as a racist, and the ADL are going to make all these,
Yeah.
all these hit pieces on me, and all these journalists are going to put all these hit pieces on me, and no one's going to take me seriously. Maybe like one fringe congressman will take me seriously or something, and that's it. So you have to kind of fit yourself into this network of interinstitutional relationships. And I got this idea from Mearsheimer when talking about structural realism in international relations. And it struck me that structural realism being you can't really understand individual state behaviors without understanding the relationship between states in the international system. And Mearsheimer goes as far as to completely disregarding the internal politics of any particular state and looking purely into the structural relationships between states to make predictions. And he makes more effective predictions from a structural realist standpoint than people who focus on the internal dynamics of the ideologies of the various states and how this should predict that they behave. Not that these things have
Interesting.
no influence. And so if you take that view and bring that into the state and say, well, what's the structural relationship between the institutions that make up the governing apparatus within a state? Again, I think that there's some validity to this view, looking at the different relationships between these states, how they form together into orthodoxies, which are kind of like international alliances in a way. Like you could see like all the different institutions aligned with the Republican Party as being kind of like, like NATO or something, and the Democrat Party are like, the old Soviet Union and all their satellites or something. You could have a kind of like a similarity here where that's how these in the kind of
But it
institutional system they fit
it's,
together.
it's,
And there's something like this in Michels, of
it,
course.
it strikes me though, Joel, that the relationship between countries is somewhat anarchic, I suppose, or there is a kind of more Hobbesian dog eat dog element to it. Whereas when I look at the development of institutions within a country, I see a kind of I see a compliance culture and a convergence culture whereby the values inside a university become the values inside, let's say Facebook or Google, which become the values inside, the Tory party, for example.
Mm.
And it doesn't really make a difference where
Well, the
you
values
are.
inside the United States become the values inside Australia, and the values inside Germany, and the values inside random
So
African
that
countries.
so
So
there's
that's
a
also true in
convergent.
the international
Yeah.
system because you have a dominant institution, or in the
Yeah.
internal system, or a dominant nation state that in order to enter into coalition with that, because like if you're in the international system and you're like some random fourth rate country, you're I mean, like, because Mearsheimer makes this point as well that like you could have this Hobbesian view, but the Hobbesian view is false in the sense that, particularly in the modern world, most states are economically reliant on other states. So, like, most countries in the world can't actually produce their own weapons. They have to buy their weapons from the bigger countries that have their like massive weapons,
Hmm.
industries. And most smaller countries also they don't have the capacity to defend themselves from all the countries around them ganging up on them. So they need to go and get like a bigger friend that'll guarantee their security. Um, and different things as well. Like a lot of states don't have enough natural resources; they have to import them from other countries and so forth. Whereas a big state like the United States has everything it needs, basically. And the same with China has almost everything it needs, and Russia has like these are very resource-rich, massive in terms of land mass nations. And so they're able to have more agency in the international system as a result because they have massive populations, massive industries, massive sets of natural resources. So in the same way, I think this is true in the political system. So you could say that there's dominant institutions that are able to kind of push things in a particular direction, and the smaller institutions have to fit themselves into those larger relationships. So obviously, like the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, Harvard, some of
Mm.
these, the CIA, like these really important institutions in the United States, they're obviously driving things in a far more direct way, and then these other smaller institutions have to fall in line.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the ultimate question though is this has not always been the case, right? There have been cases. So at the moment, there's been this massive tendency towards convergence, centralization. Everybody everybody kind of coming together in this kind of even global compliance culture whereby, as you mentioned, the values of the United States become the values of Austria or something. But at other times that seems to go in reverse, and you get balkanization, you get a breaking, you get institutions attacking each other, you get a tendency towards the uh, feudalization, I guess. But I don't know what trigger. Like, there's no, from the literature or from the elite theorists so far, I haven't really got a sense of what triggers the direction one way or the other.
Well, it seems to be like, in large extent, I mean, this is why I hold a security determinist view, reward punishment. So if you break with the orthodoxy, what are the punishments and what are the rewards? And so, in order for, because like balkanization is not simply bits breaking off, because generally balkanization comes also with the production of a new local elite. So like if a country breaks, like when the Soviet Union broke apart, it wasn't like the ruling class of these former Soviet republics are all the same exact people that were administrating them under Soviet rule. Um, there was a kind of new elites that formed in a lot of these countries. There was some kind of carryovers from the past, people that like defected. Um, but there was also and kind of institutions that were inherited by these new states, but also there was new elites that formed, new political movements that formed and asserted themselves. And so like that's also the case. I think when you see like with the United States right now, the United States is starting to like lose its capacity to punish and reward the international system for going along with its agenda. And so you saw, recently, like Angela Merkel basically told the Americans to fuck off, and we're gonna, we're gonna build Nord Stream 2, and we're gonna get gas from Russia. There was no way they would do that 20 years ago. No way.
And by the same token, do you think like Joe Biden and his administration, or the oligarchy, is unable to punish, I don't know, Florida man? Like, what can it do to Florida at this point? Because I do think we're seeing balkanization within the United States as well, in so much as there are these nodes of resistance that do not appear to be converging or complying. And I guess a compliance culture will break down if you get whole districts of the country, whole states even, that just are refusing to go along with it.
But what
Like
it seems as though is that the American elite have maxed out on psychological warfare capacity. Particularly, I think I was reading a paper the other day. I can't remember the name of the guy, but he worked in the State Department, and he wrote this paper in the early 90s, talking about shift in American strategy. And he was invoking like chaos theory and like complexity theory to describe this shift in American imperial strategy, where America, he was saying, should pursue a strategy of sabotage and like the provoking what he called criticality, basically provoking, like looking at a state that already has certain tendencies for destabilization, like an enemy state, and instead of like trying to transplant a new elite to replace them, instead just like help along forces of destabilization so that the thing falls apart. And he was talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union and basically seeing this as a grand new era in American uh, foreign policy where soft power, psychological warfare, diplomacy could be used to challenge America's enemies, as opposed to fighting them, in a direct war, Vietnam style, which was a failure. And we saw this obviously, with Arab Spring and various other kinds of things that have happened in the time since. And so I think what happened is that the American elite got very good at psychological warfare, including on its own population. It's very good at controlling the flow of information, at controlling public perception.
I think they're called masters. Hold on. In the literature, there's this book that was brought out by the Hoover Institution by Harold Dwight Laswell and Daniel Lerner by Stanford University Press. It came out in the 50s. Clearly, this was a document that was read by like government officials and people like that. And they talk in there about specialists in persuasion and specialists in coercion, And they actually do a really quite in-depth elitist analysis of Soviet Union elites, and they show how the first generation of elites under Lenin were specialists in persuasion, but then they gave over to being specialists in coercion under Stalin. And they looked at their backgrounds, they looked at the sorts of people. So in effect, there was a circulation of elites within the Soviet Union from class ones to class twos in Pareto's terms. But it strikes me that our elites have been foxes. They've been class ones. They've been specialists in persuasion for a very long time now. And we're getting to the point where, whether it's over the pandemic or over these issues internally or externally that we're talking about, they're going to have to use force sooner or later, right?
Yeah, but also they have
going.
retarded their capacity to use it. That's the thing. Because they've become so good at psychological warfare, it's kind of a poison chalice, because they've commandeered all of these traditional political and even military systems with these tactics, to the point now where the military leadership of the United States military looks completely incompetent. I don't think they would have the capacity. They were, murmuring about, challenging the Russians in Ukraine. I think if they're not going to do anything, because they would get absolutely destroyed if they tried. And the same with Taiwan and the Chinese. The American military seems more interested in trying to, you know, um, get promote trannies to high positions than actually figuring out how to win wars at this point.
One of the streams I did a while back with my buddy Pharaoh is that we looked at army recruitment adverts over the ages, and also between nations as well, to see what they were appealing to. And from around the late 90s onwards, both the British and American ads seem to switch from there was a heavy emphasis on like skills that you could gain in the army in the 80s and the 90s, and also like obviously a streak of patriotism and serving your country and all of that. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, it switched to like, see the sights, look at all the experiences you can have, and invariably there would be like a cut to like a group of girls having fun, on a night out. It's like, yeah, this is why you join the army, It's like, sorry, Owen, I don't want to dominate things, but there were two other issues I wanted to point to from.
Of course, the British Army, like the Special Forces, does kind of indirectly advertise through that. I can't remember the name of that television program. Is quite famous. I mean, they have it on television here. And so that kind of functions as. So British SAS is probably pound for pound the best military unit in the world, according to many analysts. And they just did like a war game against the Americans and absolutely destroyed the American Special Forces. So maybe that actually says something interesting.
My wife watches that show, and it is really hard. Like they show them like under psychological torture for 8-10 hours. They try to and it doesn't matter if it's men or women or anything. I have watched that show because my wife is pretty into it, and I just watch it out of the corner of my eye on occasion, and it does seem like there's no element of that. There's very little pause in that particular program that you're talking about. I think it's called SAS Who Dares Wins or something like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they do use it to recruit. But sorry, Joel, I had two other things I wanted to raise, but I realized that Owen hasn't spoken for a while, so I just didn't want to monopolize.
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in with what you guys have been saying, and like thinking of like the element of like social revolution, which in the book Michels is like quite pessimistic about the idea of like a genuine revolution occurring, how political parties within a state, or we're going to talk about like the global scene, states within a global system, will maintain kind of a metastability. Like once they've formed like a large scale powerful bureaucracy, there's a tendency to maintain that, where any sort of revolutionary force that gains momentum doesn't really like overthrow the existing bureaucracy. It just kind of merges with it. And any sort of large scale conflict between factions within the bureaucracy usually results in like a reconciliation because they recognize that it's in their shared interest to maintain the current structure, to not like disrupt it too much because they would be unlikely to maintain power after that. And yet revolutions of a sense do seem to occur. There are these like large scale qualitative shifts if you look at like over the course of centuries, let's say. And I was just thinking as you guys were talking about the relationship between parts within a system, like what causes that to occur. Like at one point in the book, Michels is talking about like anarchists and how they have this like incredibly naive view of like, if we just like stop believing in government, basically it will go away. And he points out like the foolishness of this because the logical problem of anarchism is like you would need some force to be able to maintain the anarchist state, to be able to ensure that nothing rises up to seize power. So you would basically need a very powerful central authority to resist the formation of state. And I think this is why a lot of like anarchists sort of idealistic romantic fantasies rely on some like greater social force, like like reaching peak oil or global warming happens and like there's just a wide scale collapse of civilization, because this is a force that's basically bigger than the bureaucracy, right? It's like the will of God. It's an act of nature which overthrows the existing structure.
Mosca does. You see, the thing is that I think Michels takes. I don't know if he says it anywhere, but he basically takes everything that's in Mosca, and to some extent Pareto as well, for granted, right? He's like, all that stuff, yes, but now let's like look at how let's zoom in, basically. But Mosca does. I mean, let me see if I can pull up the exact quotation here, because when it comes to these sorts of changes, like changes of elites, whether it's a peaceful circulation as usually happens in British history, or a violent one as happens in French history most of the time, he does say. I mean, let's just have a look. Let's see if I can control F if I can get to this passage. He says, as soon as there is a shift in the balance of forces, then the manner in which the ruling class is constituted changes also. If a new source of wealth develops in a society, if a practical importance of knowledge grows, if an old religion declines or a new one is born, if a new current of ideas spreads, then simultaneously far-reaching dislocations occur in the ruling class. So Moscow basically just says, like, listen, there's a whole bunch of factors that could cause social and political change to happen. And this is what I was coming back to. These guys are never monocausal, right? Marx wants the sole driver of history to be economic, right? Pareto, to a certain extent, Pareto is a bit more monocausal, because he basically says, yeah, all of this stuff, but ultimately it comes down to these sentiments, which are the real drivers type thing. But Moscow and Michels are both kind of rejectors of what is known as the single factor fallacy, and that's because I think they are ultimately historians, right? And I think that anyone who's a kind of, how can I say, like a kind of honest historian rather than an ideologue or a theorist who has like one thing they want to push, will recognize that there's any number of things that can cause change to happen. Machiavelli has a wonderful passage somewhere where he says, listen, you can have all the best plays, all the best plans in the world, but fortune is like a river, and all of your plans can come to naught overnight. There's some black swan event that could basically overturn your plans in a heartbeat. Act of God, basically. So yeah, these are all things that I think, as realists, these guys kind of acknowledge. However, I have a question which relates to this. I'll just try to bring it in the interest of the discussion, where I say so they have this tendency where they're a bit vague sometimes on what is the prime mover, because they accept different causes. And I've just written here, political leaders therefore enjoy an advantage in knowledge, communication methods, and political skills over the mass, in whom, as we've seen already, Michels considers all three resources to be totally lacking. This offers a great advance over Marxist analysis, which posits that leaders only enjoy their positions by virtue of ownership of the means of production. Michels is suggesting that it is the abilities of the leaders to organize through these three resources that justifies and maintains their position. This will become significant when we come to consider James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, because in this are the seeds for the takeover of the managers and the bureaucrats, which we've already discussed. However, if organizational ability rather than land or business ownership is the criteria by which leaders are chosen, then it stands to reason that the managers would come to challenge and displace the power of the bourgeoisie, just as the bourgeoisie displaced the old aristocracies. However, in both Mosca and Michels, the role of the rich is somewhat hazy. It is certainly the case that wealth can be used to buy influence and power, but it is not clear whether the fact of ownership can trump the practical realities of organization. When Michels broaches this topic, he talks mainly about the extent to which old leaders are distrustful of and often unwilling to cede power to new upstarts, which frequently leads to censorship and curbing of free speech. Again, it seems that organization is the decisive factor, even if wealth can grant certain advantages. Now, the reason I wanted to pause on that is because if we look at the current situation, Joel mentioned at one point the prospect of him, like, I don't know, let's say he wanted to set up a Washington think tank or whatever. The first thing that he would have to think about is, well, where am I going to get the money to do it? How many millions of dollars are you going to need to do it? Who are your financial backers going to be? And I watched Morgoth's video recently on Spengler, where he was talking about the influence of the press and the fact that the press basically is the mechanism by which the mind of the masses is controlled, if you want, or the parameters of what is allowable is. And then Morgoth used this phrase, the money power, the money power, which is, was favored by Spengler and various other people. And I have a question on this because, I mean, yes, organization, yes, managers, but I mean, this was something that came out in Murray Rothbard's analysis of James Burnham and Sam Francis that was released by the Mises Institute recently, where he was saying, like, yeah, but hold on, the Rockefeller Foundation, gave billions of dollars to this person, or, that there's usually a rich man with some purse strings behind a lot of these things as well. Or today, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation stands behind the Tony Blair Institute, or various other institutes.
Well, I got
So
a few
how do
things to
we
say about
like
this.
how do we, three of us here, resolve this now today?
Yeah, I got a few things to say about this because, for one, generally there's a conflation between money power and and economic interest, in the sense that, yes, obviously there are wealthy donors behind political movements, but this does not mean that they are simply donating money in order to reinforce their wealth, as though they're just purely interested in profit maximization or something, on like maintaining, because it stands to reason that these like the billionaire class actually have political opinions, actually care about achieving certain political goals, that they aren't purely just economic agents. Number two, it also stands to reason that if you're a billionaire and you're making decisions about how to allocate funding in terms of like political donating to different political movements, your donations are still going to be informed by your advisors, which are going to be essentially trained in some sense to become experts in order to get in a position to advise you. So presumably they've been trained by the academy. They are experts in something, um, and you're still giving your money to an organizational apparatus that you don't control. So yes, in a sense, you have a selective function, but you don't have a control function, and there's a difference between selection and control. So the Rockefeller Foundation can allocate money to you, or not allocate money to you, make decisions about who gets the money, but they can't make decisions about exactly how that money is put to use because it requires management, right? And that management has a certain agenda. And so there is obviously an incentive for the ruling class to maintain its position, but that maintenance of position is not, I don't think, some individual process whereby Peter Thiel, he just wants to maintain Peter Thiel's position, and Rockefellers, they want to maintain the Rockefellers' position. I think it makes more sense to imagine that there is a um, an orthodoxy, or maybe multiple competing orthodoxies, of how to run the government, and the wealthy elites select amongst them. So, for example, like the Rockefellers, there's a really good article that I posted about on my Telegram recently, written by Kerry Bolton, talking about the so-called Anglo-American conspiracy, and he was shitting all over this common conspiracy theory, like the Alex Jones narrative of history, that like the British
Mhm.
imperial elites, like Cecil Rhodes and like the Round Table Group described by Carol Quigley, that they somehow control the CFR and the American government and the world through some convoluted means. And he was saying, he was poking all these holes in that narrative. And generally, it rests upon the collaboration between the Rockefellers and British imperialists in the late 19th, early 20th century. Not Rockefellers, sorry, Rothschilds, I should say.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and the point that he was making was that yes, the Rothschilds did lend some support, but that's because they were, elite British citizens at the time. So it makes sense that they would support British imperialism. Wealthy elites supported the imperialism of all the states that they were in across Europe. Like the Dutch, wealthy Dutchmen supported Dutch imperialism. Wealthy Frenchmen supported French imperialism, and so forth. Um, and so the point that he was making was that uh, there was like he showed all these examples that the Rothschilds weren't necessarily like super all about British imperialism and the British imperial project, and they were willing to throw their lots in with the Americans against the British imperial interest uh, in the Second World War's aftermath. Um, and so they were willing to jump ship from one empire to another, basically, when a better deal was given. And so they didn't necessarily have loyalty. They were just supporting the best game in town. Also, you have the example of the NSDAP when Uncle Adolf comes to power in Germany. Um, he gets a lot of support from many of like the wealthy oligarchs and wealthy capitalists or whatever in German society. And then Marxists make this point then that fascism is capitalism in decay, and you know the rise to power of the National Socialists was on behalf of capital as a defense against communism. But if you read Henry Ashby Turner's book on the subject, you know that that's completely false. It was only after the NSDAP started getting themselves into a position of power that a lot of the wealthy interests, moneyed interests in Germany played ball. And so it was more the case of, well, these guys have political power, so we're going to give them money and get on their good side so that they don't screw us over, basically, as opposed to we want to fund them into power because they had very little support prior to gaining power. And so basically like I bring up all these examples because the point is that donating to like political projects isn't something that's simply done in order to enable a political project to succeed, but it's also done to gain favor from political elites, because ultimately political elites have power over over the rich. They can go after them. They actually, like, the state is able to um, take on the moneyed interest, and it's many times in history where it has. I mean, brutal like examples, like Soviet Russia or something, but there are many examples in history of conflict between political elites and dominant economic classes. We see this in Juvenal's On Power. That's basically what nationalism in its various forms and socialism in its various forms has traditionally always been, is this kind of competition between a political and economic class interest. So one solution that the dominant economic class has is to buy off political elites, make them dependent, make them friendly, and they get favors. So I think that also has to be taken into consideration, and also overall, what needs to be taken into consideration in the overarching sense is that the political agenda, the orthodoxy of the state, is a very complex process that no one person has agency over. It's a complex system with that emerges from various different actors and inputs in a complex structural relation with one another. It's a non-linear system in my view. There's um, one person changing how they act causes a chain reaction of different reactions across the system. Um, and so there, like any kind of monocausal theory of the political is highly flawed, which is why I think we need to kind of look more into chaos theory and into theories of emergence and so forth, and understanding sociology in order to account for this. So my point in saying this is that yes, the dominant economic classes do perform a selection mechanism on policy making and the political establishment. I talk about this in my article in Firstness 3. But also, so does the state. So, for example, how much money does like the Pentagon and like Pentagon related institutions put into um, uh, funding, and the U.S. State Department and the CIA and all these other institutions put into funding political movements, psychological operations, and so forth? I mean, we know for a fact that the CIA was instrumental in the rise of the neoconservatives, that the U.S. State Department was instrumental in the rise of the New Left in the 1960s, the emergence of critical theory, and they even funded post-structuralism in France. For a bunch of French intellectuals and so forth. So the state itself and political elites that are in charge of the state, they have a lot of agency over over distributing funding as well to things that they like. And so again, it's a very complex set of relations. So yes, you have to factor in the selective capacity of billionaires, of what you call like activist investors. Like Keith Woods had a great video recently on Peter Singer taking over Twitter, and there's obviously ideological motives there. Or there's various. If you look at the interests of different Wall Street bankers, Wall Street investment firms, getting their people on the boards of directors of institutions like Black Lives Matter or the Rockefeller Foundation or the Carnegie Foundation or the Ford Foundation, a very clear political agenda. There is a very clear political agenda that is supported by the most wealthy, but there is a managerial aspect to this as well. In order for them to actually construct that strategy, they are reliant upon the academic paradigms that are produced in the academy, and they are reliant upon researchers and strategists and so forth, just like political parties, to kind of come up with their strategy of what they should be funding, what they should be trying to achieve politically, and so forth. And so again, you can't subordinate the political class to their donors. Their relationship is far more complex than that. So anyway, I don't know what you think about that.
Owen?
Yeah, I do think that this is like, as I was saying earlier, like how you actually see like revolutionary shifts. Like, if you want to like rule out these romantic notions of society collapsing all at once, like it's not like some lightning strike that just causes massive change. Rather, what you see is these like step-by-step shifts that lead to unforeseen consequences. Because, like you were saying, Joel, like the political system, especially now, is so incredibly complex that even if you're one of these like super elites playing 5D chess with like your team of advisors and access to great financial power and the ability to like plan ahead 10 moves, you won't be able to see ahead 50 moves. So I think like what you see is that powerful actors, be they institutions, parties, wealthy individuals, think tanks, etc., will initiate something at one moment, perhaps with the intention, as Michels says, of maintaining kind of the metastability of the bureaucracy, of not tilting the boat too much, of just sort of keeping things level and functioning as they always have. But inevitably, what happens is what they do has unforeseeable ramifications. Like, for instance, what the American empire, as you guys were saying earlier, has been doing since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this move to like psychological warfare and perhaps these corporate interests using like woke agendas and things like that to their interests. And even if you go further back, like the empowering of China in the war against the Soviet Union, all of these things in the short term look like they play some sort of advantageous role. But as we're seeing now, I think like this seems to be turning against them. And there's this tendency, especially on the right, to attribute, I think, to the elites undue intelligence, to say like, oh, this is all part of some master plan. They've been planning this since like, the dawn of time. This is all just like part of their machinations, and I don't think that's true at all. I think like a lot of these state actors, even the most intelligent ones, are looking like a few moves ahead and doing things that are advantageous a few moves ahead, but they can't predict the butterfly effect of these things, like the long-term ramifications and how that will twist and mutate and lead to genuine qualitative changes in the system, which certainly aren't in their interest and perhaps weren't in anyone's particular interest. All that to say, like, that's a bit of it's a black pill and a white pill. On the one hand, it removes this idea that there's like this, new world order globalist elite who are just like moving every piece on the chessboard and have total control over everything. But on the other hand, it makes me wonder to what degree anyone, any group, no matter how well equipped they are, can actually, initiate something that endures, that isn't inevitably going to lead to a chaotic fluctuation. In any case, I do think there's a lot of research that needs to be done here. As Academic Agent was saying earlier, taking this idea of the oligarchic tendency of any one group and expanding it to look at the actual interrelation between different groups and how that informs like the particular choices they make.
Aspect of this to bring in quickly before I throw it back to AA, because from what we were saying before this subject, where you were talking about the American elite, and I was saying I think they overmaxed on psyop capacity, where it's eroded their more conventional political capacity. Because this relates to what Owen was saying about like the elites, people attribute them more agency than they actually have. Like everything's going to plan, when actually the system is so complex that it's impossible for any one agent to have that kind of control. Just from a cybernetic standpoint, it's impossible. Is that I think that's what we see, where the emphasis of a particular kind of strategy that suited the Americans for a particular phase has had all of this blowback. That like different things like the basically cucking the Japanese from gaining economic strength in the 80s and the 90s has led to the Chinese situation. Um, basically destroying the old conservative movement in the United States in the 50s and the 60s by bringing in a bunch of Trotskyists and neocons to replace them because they were more in line with America's foreign policy goals, has totally undermined the American conservative movement, brought it under the control of Zionists that pushed them into a bunch of stupid wars like the Iraq War that made no strategic sense. They've completely upended America's capacity to maintain, global hegemony, wasting resources on a war that made no strategic sense, whilst allowing the rise of China, whilst losing control of Europe, etc. So what you see is, people make one move, but then that ends up having ramifications 3, 4 moves down the track that you couldn't have anticipated at the time. And so I think that's kind of has been what's happened with maxing psyop capacity. We saw with Biden winning the election. Yeah, I mean, this is an example of their psyop capacity. I have to be careful about what I say about this election, because I can get my channel nuked from YouTube. But like, so they were very
What do you
effective
mean? It was the freest, fairest, most
Yeah.
fortified election in U.S. history. Yeah.
But like, the thing is that they were so effective at securing the W. However you want to say, they did it. They were very, from a strategic standpoint, from a real politics standpoint, very effective strategy in taking the W in 2020. But since they get into power, they've done an absolute terrible job of actually governing. These people can't govern. They're very, very good at. They optimized at undermining undermining the state, undermining the political authority. They can't wield it correctly, and so now if you look at the polls, I mean, they're getting rinsed, and they're almost dead. They're dead certain to lose the midterms, and they're almost certain to lose in 2024. Republicans literally just don't do anything, don't say anything, and just let them make a mess of it. And the Democrats are like, we don't even know who. Like, we don't think there's a problem with Biden, but anyone else that we could run is even less popular than he is, and they can't accomplish anything in terms of like their reform agenda. Like, it's a total mess. They're losing prestige all over the world, losing control of all these different other parts of the world, different regions in the world, and uh, they're doing a terrible job of governing, of actually ruling, because they were optimized for undermining rule. That's how they dominated the world, because they undermined a whole bunch of these different regimes, and they used those tactics against Trump. And now that's all they know how to do is undermine rule, but not rule. So it's like, you optimize one capacity and you end up sabotaging another, and it'll be their downfall.
I do think, Joel, just to come back to the elite theorists, I do think that the taking the W, as you said, was not cost free. I think a significant number of people in America no longer buy into the political formula of America. I.e., they no longer believe that the system functions as it should, and those myths, the myth of the political formula, i.e., that the government is for the, you're governed by the people, for the people, right? This is the big American dream. I do think that, regardless of what the facts on the ground are, okay, regardless of what you believe about it or anybody else believes about it, the fact remains a significant number of people do not believe the official narrative, let's just say, on the election. And I think that in and of itself represents a problem for the American ruling class, because any ruling class is only as strong as their political formula, right? As soon as the ruled no longer sign up to that, it's only a matter of time before they figure out, well, we need to organize and replace them.
But even if But even if they pissed off conservatives and like in the way that they did, if they came in and they got the economy going, and they, with that whole idea of the adults will be in the room, that was the narrative that they gave to like leftists was, Biden, he's a little cringe, he's a little bit of a spaz, but the Biden administration is going to be far, far better, and we're going to return to this kind of, proper, like we had under Obama, this, the American ruling class will be back in charge, and we business as usual. We'll get the economy going again. We'll get international relations sorted. Foreign policy will make sense, and they've come in and they've done. The economy has been rubbish. The foreign policy has been one embarrassment after another.
Yes.
And so
I tell you what, I tell you something else that has been that it's funny, actually, coming back to Michels as well, is that there's a whole chapter in Michels where he talks about how the old guard protect their position against the young aspirants, as he calls them, the upstarts, right? And that that there's always a dynamic, and again, he's talking about socialist parties most of the time, but I mean, you could apply it to the right as well, but he just so happens to be talking about socialists, and he says that there's a number of tricks that the old guard use against the young aspirants. And in my lecture, I just couldn't help but think, when he was reading about that, about the old guard in the Democrat Party, because they're so old, right? They're all in their 70s and 80s, right? I mean, literally ancient. Biden, Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren is in his 70s, even like Bernie Sanders is in his 70s, right? And the young aspirants are obviously like, the squad, AOC, forget the names of the others, Presley, is it, Omar, forget the name of the last one, Rashid or something. And every single trick that Michels outlines in this chapter, I have seen the old guard Democrats use against the squad. We're the adults in the room. You guys are extremists. You're irresponsible. Subordination and party discipline is ultimately important. And we have seen, like, regardless of what people on the right may think of it, we have seen the AOC and co being like cucked by Pelosi like 7, 8, 9 times now, like publicly told off many times. And I just think that they have a problem from the outside, i.e., if they present themselves as the adults in the room against like Trump or whatever, but also internally, because how long before the Democrat base say, well, hold on a second, you keep on telling us you're the adults in the room, and you're like, this is a shit show. Like, did you do it? So it's almost, I mean, Prater doesn't say this. He just, everything's like a ruse, but I suppose it does depend on actually being good at organizing. To your point, Joel, like, you actually have to be good at these things in order for that message to carry any weight. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, like the United
is
States government can have the biggest military budget in the world and throw incredible resources at Lockheed Martin and all these other military industrial complex organizations. But if they keep wasting it and building overpriced junk, then it doesn't matter. If the Chinese are spending half what the Americans are spending, but they actually have competent industry building their aircraft carriers and their hypersonic missiles and their fighter jets and so forth. Just sheer sheer wealth can't necessarily get you over the line. You actually have to have organization, right? And it's the same, I think, with when it comes to the political. Like, you can have these massive institutions throwing money at different political ventures, but if you have incompetent strategy, if you have incompetent administration, you're just pissing that money up the wall. You're not going to actually get, still not going to accomplish your goals. I mean, obviously money helps, but it's not as though you can just go dollars in, political power out. It's not that simple. So
I mean, do you actually think, Joel, that we're seeing like bioleninism in action? Basically, that we're just the regime is just down to so many like people who are, because it's I've been reading like Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann and people like this recently as well for this course that I'm writing. One of the things that struck me time and again is just how inept the current propagandists are, versus a Bernays, like how subtle and kind of, how good he was at manipulation, as compared with what we see today, where it's just so kind of clunky and inept and ends up pissing off half the audience and all this sort of stuff. I just think they're bad. They're just like, the elites are just, they're lacking they're increasingly lacking in exactly those skills that Michels points to in political parties. They're not persuading. I mean, why do we exist? We shouldn't exist. None of the three of us should exist. We should just be, card carrying liberal Democrats. But this is, they've actively succeeded in turning the three of us against them. By being inept at persuasion. Am I wrong?
I mean, I think that's true when you're talking about like like CNN or something, MSNBC, New York Times type egregious propaganda. But I think there's more subtle propagandists on the right that have been very effective at recuperating the rejection of that energy and the production of, really retarded conspiracy theory discourse. I mean, obviously, I'm not like anti all conspiracy theories because a lot of them are true, but you're seeing this proliferation of just because you disagree with the official narrative doesn't mean your narrative isn't also wrong. You know what I mean? And there's a proliferation of bad narratives on the right that have recuperated a lot of the energy, the dissident energy, I think, as well, quite effectively.
There's a difficult path to kind of, because I understand exactly the what you guys are trying to say here. The trouble we have is that because the what Mike from Imperium Press calls the anarchistic view of the world, the accidental view of history, is so prevalent and is so powerful, I spend a lot of time arguing with the Tory boys on Twitter, for example, and that narrative is so strong that the very suggestion of minority organization, for example, in itself is seen in the realm of conspiracy theory. It's just like, well, hold on, how does anybody, so these things that Michels is talking about here, is
The problem
is
isn't a
not
conspiracy theory. The problem is
yeah.
a lack of epistemic integrity, where people say, "Oh, well, this doesn't feel right," and so they then presume like there's a smuggling in of, because this is what you get when you have when you basically have a mass media system that is just driven by, I think, clicks, right? So if you can come up with a
Mm.
narrative that's very emotionally, that's what good propaganda is. Good propaganda
Yeah,
is it activates the emotions of the target. And so I think a lot of this, like for example, Alex Jones, who I think is
yeah,
incredibly entertaining, probably one of the most entertaining human beings alive in the world today. I could watch that guy for hours. He is one of the great propagandists. You know what I mean? Like of
right,
our
yeah.
time. And that's what I mean. Like people like this, that they're so effective, and they're so likable, that you know that they're bullshitting you a little bit, but you still want to watch it anyway, almost like because they're just so likable. There's many figures like this,
Yeah,
and
well, that's what I was going to go on to say, Joel. So on the one hand, you get people who just outright deny that there could be anybody with an agenda trying to affect things, right? On the one hand, and then in the other extreme case, you have the conspiracy theorists who, it's almost like the system can never take an L in these, like everything is planned. I remember this around the time of Afghanistan. It's like, oh well, you've got to understand that this was the plan all along, to be there for 20 years and lose, um, so it's like, I mean, I don't know what you do with that though, because they're both people end up somehow on the right, like the total anarchist and the person with the totally emergent, accidental view of history, then the person with everything is a plan by 52 chess Rothschilds, masters, like,
yeah, well,
um,
it's also that, but it's also the some of the conspiracy theories are obfuscations as well. So, like for example, with Alex Jones, he's very careful not to ever implicate Zionists in a whole bunch of things. Um, and you can actually see evidence that he knows better, because you can find videos on Odyssey of him and his radio show back in the 2000s where he called out Zionist infiltration of the American government. And you can see
right.
him counter signal that and blame like there was that really famous video that Keith Woods and I have been making fun of, where he stopped himself from saying Jews and said West Germans, like West German intellectuals.
Right,
And so
right.
we've been calling them West Germans, like uh,
I mean, didn't he have a debate on this in recent time? I feel like somebody confronted him about it, and he had a debate about it recently. But I could be wrong about that.
I don't know about recently. There's the famous time when he had David Duke on his show many, many years ago, and they debated the subject. David Duke is a little bit of a crank on some of these issues as well, but nevertheless, it was interesting. But like my point is that it's not as though I'm averse to um, conspiracy theories. I mean, I believe in a lot of them, but it's like it's more complicated than this. It's not just like conspiracy versus non-conspiracy. It's more just like the actual specifics of what happened, what didn't happen. And you're right that there
Hmm.
is this, obviously this mainstream aversion to anything that sounds like a conspiracy theory must be false, which is ridiculous. Like this idea that no one conspires, no one organizes to do anything, that doesn't make any sense at all. Just like in principle. But also you have this kind of emotivist feelings based, or just frankly just bad history. People just have bad readings of history, bad takes where they apply Marxist analysis, or they apply various other kind of copes that are just historically inaccurate narratives of history.
Mhm.
That basically what you can only really engage that epistemically and say, well, look, your narrative of history is wrong. Here's why. Here's why this is actually the best way to understand this, or
Yeah, I
whatever.
mean, I've also noticed a tendency on the, I call them kooks, and I got to know some of these guys over the course of the U.S. election. It was a hell of a lot of fun for some of us to follow along. It was just so crazy that couple of months. But every once in a while I check back in with them to see, is Trump still the president then or what? Type thing. But one of the tendencies
Arrests are
I've
coming.
noticed.
Patriots in control.
Yeah, Patriots in control. Yeah, trust the plan. The one of the tendencies I've noticed with those sorts of guys, though, is the need to tie everything in. So they will always mention JFK, for example. They will always and also the need to say it's always been the same actors through history. So now you're basically like going all the way back to the French Revolution, and it's like it's the same people all the time. I don't mean that particular ethnic group that you had in mind, but this secret society or that secret society, and the need just to have this one story that explains all things. I find again, usually when you start doing that, you're not really doing history anymore, because then like nothing is believable, like nothing that happens is ever real. When you get to that sort of thing,
Yeah, I mean,
everybody becomes somebody's control opposition or whatever.
it's just like it's part of it is just low IQ and schizophrenia type things, and part of it is just but that's the effective thing about propaganda. I mean, even Uncle Adolf, obviously, the National Socialists had very effective propaganda, and they make the point that, well, obviously, you can't boil everything down to the JQ, but we don't want to confuse the people, so we might as well. I mean, it's a lot of stuff does, so we might as well just be reductionist about it, because we don't want to confuse people and get people all distracted on other issues or whatever. So like that, and that obviously was quite quite effective for them, and you can see even today that there is a portion of people online. I mean, I am someone who is let's say red pilled on the subject,
Uh-huh.
but it's never enough for some people. Like, you got to they get obsessive about it to the point where it's pathological, even if they are right. They're right for the wrong reasons, kind of thing, because they have this pathological fixation on the issue that that they become obsessive. Everything has to fit into their categories of the world. These are the bad guys that are responsible for everything wrong. Um, and obviously, like, that again, like I said, the real problem is epistemic integrity when we're trying to do good theory. And that's just an emotional fixation, and that's what you get with a lot of the discourse around lots of different issues today with conservatives is a very emotivist kind of
Mm-hmm.
fixation with the world, where if anyone, like, I went on the kill stream yesterday and I was talking about COVID, and I don't support vaccine mandates or lockdowns or any of
Uh-huh.
this stuff. I've spoken out against it since like early 2020. And I was against the narrative very early on, and I made the point that, well, there is a certain amount of sensationalization of Australia, because people always ask me,
Yeah.
oh, like, what's it
Mm-hmm.
like in Australia? And I'm like, well, I live in the biggest city in Australia, and it's pretty much back to normal. It's not as bad as any other European country. We don't have like lockdowns for the unvaccinated or something like they do in some European countries. Like, this idea that Australia is this unique
Yeah.
authoritarian response. I've seen reports from Canada and other European countries that are way worse than things that have happened here. But then they have this, oh, well, they're building camps for. But this is again like this is only in one very particular part of the country that I've never even been to in my life, where they have this in the Northern Territory. It's like a fringe occurrence. And like I said, it's just like obviously it's not nice that they do it, and I don't support it either. But it's like, okay, you go into this room for 2 weeks and then you go home. It's not like as if, like, okay, that's a very annoying thing to have to
Mm-hmm.
do, but it's not like as if, like, your life's ruined forever because you had to go and stay in this room for 2 weeks. Like, it's an uncomfortable experience. It's like obviously like they tried to glamorize it, and people have like acted silly, like kind of like downplaying it too much, like that Claire Lehman
Yes,
journalist or
yeah.
whatever. But I was like, look, it's it on the whole, it's not like people are overreacting. Like, oh, they're rounding us up into camps. Like, what's next? Like, like as if like the government's gonna round up everyone who who gets COVID and put them in a camp forever for what reason? Like, it doesn't even make any sense. And then I said that, and then there's a bunch of people in the the comment section that are like, oh, like how like this guy's ridiculous. All Australians, they're just used to living in chains. They're all like, it's just like all this like
Yeah,
ridiculous nonsense. It's like
yeah.
it's just schizo. Like it doesn't even make any sense. Like
Yeah, no,
so.
you see, the trouble is though, is that we're living at a time where it would help though if global elites didn't act like they were a satanic cabal. It's like if that wasn't so believable, it would it would probably help with some of
Well, I'm
the
sure some of
schizo
them
stuff
are
that
in
you're
the
talking
satanic cabal. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily false, but it's just more complicated than that. I mean,
about. All right. Anything else, chaps? Or
no, I think we've got this is a good place to end it. But thanks for
Yeah,
coming on. It was great to have you on. Hopefully we do something again soon.